You've raised this question then of what is contingent, what is contingent on what, and what are the outcomes from it. If we're thinking about it, as you say, collectively, well, there's an institutional, organisational contingency there. It may be different when it's more localised rather than nationalised. Whether, on the other hand, you've got things about people's value set, what they value, what their values are, and again coming into the whole notion of organisational justice and how people are making sense of that. Now, it was interesting that, yeah, looking back in the literature when you were initially scrutinising things, you were saying, well, okay, so you've got this best practice literature. If we do that, then this will universally happen. On the other hand, you've got the contingency approach, which says, no, 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 you've got to match it to circumstances. You took it a stage further because what you said was, this is dynamic. It's although I think there was something about the ways in which the contingency theorists very much advanced from that tradition when the initial HRM came into being. Oh, no, 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 the best practice, we find that there are a lot of unanticipated adverse outcomes. No, it's contingent, but it's more than that. Obviously, we have the configurational approach. Okay, it's a portfolio of things, but I think you took even that further forward and said, but wake up. This is dynamic. It's not something that's fixed, and that if you're going to be effective in setting a strategic base and then managing it operationally, you've got to keep an eye on things all the time. It's not standing still.
No, it absolutely doesn't. And I think if anything, I think we're further along that road than we were, and that notion of agility for organisations is even more important. You can't overstate, can you, at the moment, how fluid certain things seem to be. Not to get too topical and political, but even the sort of, for many organisations, even the tariffs that they're going to be paying from one week to another seem to be changing in terms of imports and exports. So yeah, it's an incredibly dynamic environment, and very really challenging for organisations to respond to that and respond quickly and agilely. And that's where I think it's also important to have those underlying principles, because that's where you end up if your sort of strategy and your sort of planned approach is just going to be on shifting sands, then it's got to be anchored by those principles of, well, how do we do things, how do we want to interact with all those different stakeholders, but our employees chiefly as well. So I think there's a lot in there about that, and it's a situation that you can only see getting more and more fluid as time goes by.
Very diplomatic way of it's interesting you introduced the word agile too. One of the things that I think our students, and indeed the people that perhaps we might advise in the field, can get hung up on is that sometimes a label gets hung on something. Of course, agile working, it's a few years ago now, but it was another consultancy prescription. And the danger with that is you actually forget what it really means. And I think that's where you're right about being agile, but you've given it greater weight because you said because the situation is so fluid or dynamic. And so it's not just agility. Oh, well, yes, it's a label of a particular, do these things. Because again, we're back to best practice. What you've said is no, you've actually got to keep your finger on the pulse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Just thinking about then moving across to the academic world. First, before I ask you about translating some of your research findings, the frameworks into your teaching as well as your leadership practice, let's at least put a nod into methodology. You chose to challenge yourself by taking on, if you like, the econometricians. Not an easy thing to do, that you decided to go down the road, or indeed some of the psychologists, and it's very much about the statistics, quantitative rather than qualitative. A lot of people, when we talk to our students, if they're, I don't know, they're doing their undergraduate or postgraduate even dissertations, they, oh, I'm a qualitative person because we're in HR, we're touchy-feely, aren't we? And I think what you said, and it probably reflects your industrial relations background. No, this is hard-edged stuff. Can you just talk a bit about, so
Yeah.
what made you think, oh, okay, and I know, okay, we're doing the work with the CIPD and carrying out the survey work, but nevertheless, you actively chose to put this at the core of how you were going to tackle this incredibly difficult topic. And it is a challenge to do it, particularly, as I say, given that it's not been the norm within the academic or practical field. Any reflections on that? Are you
Yeah,
pleased you
yeah.
did, or for the unwary in the future?
It
What do you think?
definitely, and as you know, as we've had conversations before, I never felt like quants was my natural home. I felt much more that the quals was something that, and I set out in the research that I did to try to do it, to try and do both at one point. And I think realized that it was too much to do both, and actually the quants was where the real story was. That that's what it was for me. And I think it was for me personally, for someone who just about got over the line with maths GCSE. So so embarking on inferential statistics was fairly hardcore, I have to say. However, I became really fascinated by some, and I think one thing that I would say to anybody wanting to go down that road is there's lots of help out there. In a way that a few years ago, if you're stuck with textbooks, it would to try and get your head around all those formula, and very, very challenging. But there's a great amount, YouTube itself is a fantastic resource for these things, and there's other tuition guides and things out there. But I think that being able to really interrogate the data, and in different ways, and I ended up using regression analysis a lot, but also some other for some, because some of the data was in different forms, so being able to use differing types of analyses. So we used cluster analysis and paired t-tests and the Wilson-Coxon test, or forgets all of the names of them now, there's many names of them, but it really meant that yeah, and I think there's part of me that wants to say, actually it's not all about the quants, because you have to, once you've got those outputs, it's then about contextualizing them, and doing that proper sort of inferring what this means within an organization, what the meaning of these outputs. And I think that's really important. I think that is a lot easier to do when you're doing more qualitative work. But I think the reality is, I guess that as you say, the world values the numbers, and values those harder sort of edged outputs. And I think as you say, we had this incredible data set from the CIPD and the work that we've been doing with them. And I think that's for me, that started as a challenge, but really was a blessing, in terms of having that amazing data set to work with, and all of the stories that it had to tell that was hidden in that enormous SPSS database that I had to tease out slowly over time.
Well, I mean, I think it's the point. In a way, reflecting on what you've just said, I think you adopted your dynamic contingency thinking there. because you made the point, it's the story. And how can we best unlock the story? And is that the advice maybe we give our students or people who aspire to this? Look for the story first. And then you need to say, well, what's fit for purpose? So yeah, dynamic contingency.
Yeah.
And yes, thank goodness our colleague Liz Marriott also helped a great deal early on in sort of clearing up data and all those kinds of things. But I think you did amazing work to bring out the insights that you did, and as I say, to be able to make that really unique contribution that moved forward those decades and decades. I mean, we go back, don't we, to good old Hill Bed-Ends work and the employment relationship in the 1950s.
50s.
And here was you actually being able to say, well, okay, and then people navigated through the 80s and 90s and they had their models. What you've done is to challenge that. Again, you use the right vehicle to tell the story and you unlocked something which obviously is great for those people that are going to make use of this in the future. Talking about making use of it then, so what are the kind of influences your research has had on you when you're giving advice, when you're giving advice to colleagues as a senior manager, as well as advising students? Any things that you can reflect on?
I think, to start on, to start with, in terms of students, I think one of the things that I've always noted is that students come to the study of reward management with a little bit of trepidation, partly because of the numbers, I think, and partly because of perhaps the slight reputation that some areas of the curriculum could be a bit dry or a little bit technical. And to be fair, there are areas, sort of pensions and pay setting and things and compa ratios and stuff, which doesn't necessarily light fires in all of us. And I think certainly for at sort of postgraduate and doctoral level, I suppose I've always and not by accident I'm talking about the story, because I think that's probably advice that you've given me over the years, which I've repurposed and reused, and I think that's really important to look for those areas of and areas that will interest you, as if you're doing that sort of master's level, doctoral level research, that you can you can get excited about and work with. And I think there are lots of that, tons of that in the reward management field, because of its multidisciplinary nature and how it can be conceptualized in lots of different ways through lots of different lenses. I think, and I think genuinely as well, as you say, challenging the narrative and the established models is potentially fairly high risk, but can also pay dividends, and is a really fairly bold thing to do, but can prove really helpful. And most of the time when doing that, we're not throwing out everything. We're doing what I did with this piece of work, which was really to, as you say, to build on what's there already, and to test it a little bit in different contexts, and put it under a bit of strain and say, well, is that really the case, or actually we just need to adapt and amend and see it in a slightly different way. So I think that's been useful for students. From a practical point of view, I think my research has informed my practice, both in terms of the limited bit of sort of consultancy I do, now and again, but also in the organisation that I work for, in terms of feeding into things like people strategy and so on. It is about, I suppose, that really not getting too hung up on the process side of things, and really going back to those, what the principles are, what is it that we want to achieve, and how do we best achieve those things, and and using that, you know, there's principles of sort of fairness and justice, of showing how we can value individuals, even within the constraints that organisations might have in terms of how they need to do some of that work, and seeing that reward as a much bigger picture. And again, in the book we talk about this, you know, the often called total reward in some circles, but that sort of non-financial reward and recognition that sits alongside the more tangible monetary value aspects of pay and reward. And I think ensuring that you've got that, it's not just about the kind of, you know, the kind of fine level detail of the kind of process oriented, but that bigger picture thing. And I think that's where, for me, that notion of the importance of strategy comes back in. But and again, strategy can mean different things to different people, but that idea of bigger picture, having that sort of strategic systems mindset, really understanding those inputs and what happens to them, and how those things come out as outputs and outcomes, is hugely important for people to do, because I think we all get quite hung up on, you know, the fine detail of policies and processes sometimes. So yeah, that's, I think, where I'd say that's an important aspect of organisational practice.
I agree, and I think that's probably one of the unique contributions, dare I say it, in our book, that the chapter that you lead on at the end, the final one, that actually is coming back, you know, the helicopter view,
Yeah.
drawing all these things together. So we've tried to get into the nitty-gritty, and although you could argue that we're reward evangelists because we do find it interesting and we want to share that with other people, at the end of the day, it's something that is very practical. There are stories to tell in it, but as you rightly say, once you've actually gone and got into the detail, you've recognised all the issues, it's then stepping right back. As I say, I think that's a fairly unique contribution, so that you clearly lead on particularly well, and I think beautifully informed by your research, let alone all the other things we've done. And again, you've underpinned it just. This is not to say we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It is building on what has gone before. You know, there's the phrase, I know, standing on the shoulders of giants, but to a degree this is true. You know, and we say about going back to the period, well into the last century, but things change, and therefore reflecting on that